Okay, so the Fed just had their big meeting the other day. It's June 12th, I think, and they gave us a new forecast. And what they do here is they show their March forecast and then their latest one, so the June forecast. And you can see what they change, kind of how their views of the economy are changing. And what we see is that pretty much not much change, a little bit higher inflation in 2024 than before. The other ones didn't move very much, but you see a higher interest rate, much higher in 2024. What this says kind of is that they're not looking at changing their interest rates. Maybe you get one Fed cut in 2024, not two that Wall Street had been hoping for. And they've been hoping for even more than that before. It's looking like the Fed is going to stick to their sort of higher for longer. The economy is doing well. Inflation is coming down. Why rock the boat is sort of their view. At the same time, though, the unemployment rate has been creeping up. I think it was a year ago or so, the number of unemployed was like 6.1 million or so, and now it's 6.5 million unemployed. And the rates crept up from 3.6, 3.7 to 4. So they're watching that as well, saying, how much more. That's sort of the other side of the coin is, are they willing to let many more people be unemployed as a trade-off? Even if unemployment, again, the historical average for unemployment is like 5.8. So even if you let unemployment go to 4.2 or 4.3, that's not high historically, but every one full percentage point is 1.6 million unemployed. We've got like 160 million employed people. And so if you add one to the unemployment rate, 1%, that is, 1.6 million. That's a lot of people that are going to be unhappy. It's easy when you're in the ivory tower to do that. And I think the Fed group, they're well aware of this, and they take their employment mandate very seriously along with the inflation mandate. So that is what part of their argument right now is. Inflation's looking good. It's coming down. Job creation is very solid, as Karl mentioned. The unemployment rate is creeping up, and they've got to watch that because they don't want it to creep up probably too much further. But what they did is they said, no, we don't think we're going to make as many interest rate cuts as we did before. And the interest rates kind of don't come down till 3 for a couple of years. And remember, we had almost 0 for a while. These other numbers all look good. There's nothing in here that indicates recession. If you had an unemployment rate, maybe more like 4.5, you see job creation go to 0. You could have one, even with these numbers, you could sneak a recession in there, but it wouldn't be very serious, at least if these numbers prevail. So yeah, could we have hit an economic peak and then things be a little bit off the peak? Yes, and theoretically you could call that a recession, but it wouldn't be very deep, not like the Great Recession or something like that.
I have a question. Maybe it's rhetorical right now, and that is, does labor have to be the cudgel for controlling inflation?
Meaning higher unemployment?
Yeah.
That's the historical idea, right? The Phillips curve, the sort of trade-off between unemployment.
Yeah, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but I'm just
that's a fair question for what we're talking about right now. And that is sort of the mainstream view, is that you do make a trade-off. Like Larry, what was his last name?
Summer.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Larry Summer is an eminent economist, very influential. And he said, to get this inflation under control, you're going to need to have really high unemployment. So far, he's been wrong. But what's it going to take?
Surprise.
Right, Mark.
What's it going to take to get that unemployment rate? The inflation rate down from the 3 something it is now down to 2, or the PCE inflation is what they use. So 2.6 down to 2. The Fed wants to be here in that 2026 area, and they think they have a path to get there over 2 years without the unemployment rate going up very much. This is actually, I think this is something that we should look at with a certain amount of relief. Like, this is a soft landing for sure. If you aren't already there, this is pretty soft. Like, this is not a big jump in unemployment rate. So the Fed thinks, to your point, the Fed thinks they can get away with it. Larry Summers is an example of someone who takes that Phillips curve very seriously, and that he didn't think we could. What's he saying lately? I haven't followed him lately. What's his view these days? Anybody know?
I don't
either, but he got some credit initially for predicting that inflation was going to jump. Not everybody thought that. I clearly didn't. I said for a long time I didn't think inflation was going to be an issue here, but he was right about that. But he was right for some wrong reasons. It wasn't driven by the things he thought it was driven by. He was more on the demand side, that the Biden stimulus was going to cause all these problems, and it was probably more, half and half with supply side stuff, with the pandemic disruption still causing issues. So it's the research has come along to say it's at least half and half, and the Biden stimulus is probably not the big contributor as much as Republicans would love to say it is. I skipped one. So here is the dreaded dot plot, and many of you have probably seen this. The way this thing works is each of these dots represents a Fed governor and what they think the interest rates are going to be. And it says midpoint of target range. So there's a little drama there, but let's just pretend it's an average. This is kind of what they think interest rates are going to be. And so you've got about, and 5.5 is where we are now, more or less. 5.25 to 5.5. And so a few of them think it's going to be where it is now, but more of them think it's going to be one step down, and the majority, actually, the larger, not the majority, but the largest, what's the word, plurality, thinks it's going to be down below 5. So 2 cuts. This is sort of the no cuts. This group is the 1 cut, and then the lowest group is the 2 cut group. The 2 cut group is the biggest group, but the majority is either no cut or 1 cut. And so here's Heather Long, who's one of the main economists, not economists, she's an economic journalist for the Washington Post. And she said, here's her interpretation. She's averaging out as sort of 1 cut that she thinks in 2024. And there's her count, 4, 7, and 8. That's what she's talking about as the dot plot. So when you see this sort of language, that's the translation for 2024. And then 2025, you see a lot of them are much lower. And then 2026, in the long run, not much different from 2026. So they are, they see a steep decline. And I think that's good news for the budget deficit, as we talked about before, the interest on the debt. That's going to help. And then also this forecast generally is good news. If you're a president, I would definitely take this as a pretty solid economy, pretty happy with these numbers. Here are some quotes from the conference. And I will tell you that one of the most useful sources of information you can get are Fed speeches, which are available on their site. And you can usually look at the titles to sort through the ones that are for a general audience versus the ones that are for a very technical audience that aren't going to help. I wouldn't even understand them. You're not going to understand them very well. But the big press conference that he does when they release these numbers, it's every other month, I believe, that's where you're going to get some pretty good information about what's happening. And so here are some quotes. I'm not going to read them all, but growth, he's saying, is slowing but solid. Strong job creation. He gives credit to immigration, reflecting increases in participation among the 25 to 54-year-olds we talked about, and a continued strong pace of immigration. Labor market is getting back to sort of pre-pandemic. And one of the things that you don't think is a big deal because you don't hear about it in the news, but remember that chart we shared with you that showed kind of the ratio of jobs to openings to employed? That's a big deal to the Fed. They watch that. It's called the JOLTS report that comes out. JOLTS stands for something. I don't know what it all means. But when he says labor conditions are returning back to sort of the pre-pandemic, he's talking about that ratio that was about 1.2 before the pandemic. And then it went up to 2. And now back down to 1.2, approximately 1.3. It's a little bit higher than pre-pandemic. But he's saying that the ratio of those job openings to unemployed is more reasonable now. It's pretty much back to the pre-pandemic. That's what he's talking about with that one. Long-term inflation expectations appear well anchored. And I usually share a slide that shows kind of what the difference is between bonds that are inflation protected and bonds that are not, otherwise same bond. And that those are very much under control in the low 2 range and have been for a while. We do not expect it will be appropriate to reduce the target range for the Fed funds rate. In other words, that's interest rates, until we have gained greater confidence that inflation is moving down to 2%. Remember that in the first couple of months of this year, there were some hot readings of inflation. And then last month, I'll show you the slide here in a minute, we actually had a 0% reading. The price level did not go up from April to May. And so he wants to see more of that. He's saying, I want to see a few more months like that before I feel confident that we could lower interest rates. That's kind of where he's coming from. And then the last one, labor market has eased, tightness has eased, inflation has declined. The risk to achieving our employment and inflation goals has moved toward better balance. He's feeling pretty good about where things are. The unemployment rate is not jumping that much. It's up, but not crazy. Inflation is slowly coming down. He's liking that, is how I interpreted what I heard. But when you read, you can actually download this transcript and you get the very concise Fed, his statement of, it takes about 5 minutes to read his statement. And then he goes through the press conference with the Q&A. It's a little bit tougher to read, but it's very useful. A lot of this stuff comes from both places. It's in both areas. But so every now and then a person will ask him a real thought-provoking question. You'll get some interesting back and forth.
Is it on YouTube?
It probably is. I'm sure it is. Yeah, that makes sense. You can
because the Bank of England, it's you can see it also. It's quite interesting as well.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's great. If you don't want to read the transcript, watch it on YouTube by all means. Yep. I often have to read what the Fed says like 2 or 3 times to understand it. So you may need both, but yeah, if you want a quick hit and watch them in live, I think that's a great idea to watch it on YouTube. So here's the inflation for 1 month, comparing to what inflation was, how much the price level went up versus 1 month earlier. And so as I mentioned, it was 0 in May. So prices did not change on average. Some categories, of course, went up, some went down, but 0. October, we had 0.1. May of last year, we had October of 2023, May of 2023. When was it? I think, was it July of 2022 that we had a 0? There was a 0 in there before. It was even a hair negative, I think. But we haven't had one that was like, minus 0.2 or something. That would be nice to see something like that. But we'll see. This one is what is contributing to the inflation rate. And this is monthly headline inflation. So it's kind of they're looking at these bars. We're not talking about versus year ago yet. We're going to get there. This is saying that housing, meaning rent, was almost all of this inflation, and it was offset by energy. So gas prices offset shelter or rent. And we've talked about that for a few months, that it's usually a battle between the two. Now, if you get gas prices going up, you're going to get a pretty hot reading. Like you see here, like here's one where energy was adding. So you had those pretty hot readings in the last couple of months because energy was going the wrong way. Gas prices were going up, and now here they're down. And that's pretty nice, particularly considering it's the summer and gas prices tend to rise in the summer. This looks pretty good. Hopefully we'll get gas prices.
I predict that gas prices will go down for the month of June as well when I look at the national average gas prices from mid-May to mid-June.
Okay, no, that's a good heads up. If that happens, that would be great. I mean, those gas prices down is going to help, because it's really, you can look at this dark blue line as been pretty consistent all along, right? Rents have not fallen the way they expected. I think Karl and I have shared slides with you before about how these sort of real-time readings for rent are down or flat, but that this doesn't seem to be getting into the government numbers. And even the Fed chair was talking about that, like they thought that there would be a 6-month or a year lag in those numbers, and it's just not changing. This number has been very much, consistently bad all along. And I don't think it's not easy to get at, meaning clearly it hasn't come down very much despite the Fed raising interest rates significantly. And there's an argument out there that the Fed, by having high interest rates and sort of which causes the housing market to not want to build a lot of new housing, that may be making the situation worse, but that is not a consensus view. I haven't heard the Fed say that. Yep.
The Biden administration is currently selling gasoline out of the big reserve. That's been authorized for years, but that's one of the reasons the gas prices are down.
Okay. No, that's a great point. Okay.
Strategic petroleum reserve or strategic oil reserve, depending on what you call it.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I think this was actually gasoline.
Actually, gasoline, so it's already refined. Well, they were going to start. I mean, the stuff I thought was in the strategic petroleum reserve was, I thought, crude, and I thought that's what they were going to start pumping again.
There actually is a strategic gasoline reserve, and they're releasing this in Massachusetts on the East Coast. a million barrels, and it is basically Congress ordered it some years ago, and Biden has been using these scheduled releases to attack pricing, and he's done a dirty job on OPEC on the oil side, and now he's doing something on the gas side. But this is refined product; it's benzene.
So anybody who is planning on a summer vacation may be blessed with slightly lower gas prices than otherwise. No, that wouldn't be bad.
Right.
Assuming we're not going to have to put our tanks in Ukraine, we're probably all right.
Yeah.
That's I'm not too worried about it, but it's something to think about. There's a reason for that reserve. All right.
You're right.
Those are good points. Thank you for bringing them up.
Thank you, diesel.
You're right. That's a good point, isn't it? You would be using diesel fuel and not regular gas for that stuff.
Our tanks use JP1.
What is the difference? What's JP1?
Jet fuel.
You said jet fuel? Is that what that is?
Yeah, it's not a lot different than diesel as I understand it, but
Wow.
It's basically kerosene, I think.
Do you remember?
Great.
Do you remember the ads for the final filter on your gasoline from Standard Oil? That's about the difference between diesel and JP1.
That is cool. Okay, I had no idea. All right. Glad you corrected me.
Well, I think the Abrams tanks can burn just about anything because they're a turbine engine and they don't have C-octane or octane requirements that are very high, from what I understand.
I prefer JP1.
Yeah, prefer.
E85.
I'll bet they'd run.
How many miles per gallon did they get?
A mile, I think.
I think it's 6 gallons to the mile.
Okay, that's fair. Yep. All right. Yeah, those things are terrifying. How fast? Like 50 or 60 miles an hour? Something crazy like that? I mean, it's nuts what they can do. All right. So this is versus a year ago. So this is what you normally hear more of in the media as inflation's been coming down, both the core and all, but they're still a little high for the Fed. Bear in mind now, the Fed uses the PCE rate, which I showed you the forecast before was kind of like 2.6 is what they're expecting. The PCE is a little bit lower. It involves some other assumptions we've covered in prior meetings. It's a different measure, and they think they like it better. They use it over there. But this is the headline stuff that you usually see. And so people think this number should be 2, but the Fed would probably be fine with this more like 2.5. This one, you got to get to think of it as this one, you get to 2.5, that gets the PCE down to 2. And then the Fed is happy. They're not really chasing 2.0 here, in other words. Here is just kind of what happened by category. And so these are from November here all the way to May. These are versus the prior month. So these are, and then over here is versus a year ago. Only that last column is versus a year ago. And so the green means good, 0. Yellow means it's still a little bit up, like the food away from home. And I think there's an interesting split here. Notice food at home, so groceries, have been negative or 0 for the past 4 months. And we're 0 in November. Grocery prices have not been going up a lot in the last year or so. But food away from home, people going out and partying it up, this has been pretty solid. There's a 0.1 here, but everything else has been pretty, people are doing this. People are going out. They don't do that if they don't have money. They're going out. Energy, gasoline was hurting us for 3 months here, and now it's big negative in May. Big negative meaning good news for inflation perspective. It's green. This was prices going up, prices going down. And then shelter has been consistently bad, red throughout. It's always this 0.4. And it just mentally, if you multiply that by 12, 4.4 by 12 is 4.8. Technically, it wouldn't be just that kind of math. There's a little more compounding in there, but it doesn't make a huge difference in 1 year. But it's still, this is a solid rate, 5.4 versus a year earlier, and this is heavily weighted. Rents are a big part of what people spend their money on. Shelter is very heavily weighted. Not every row here is evenly weighted. All right. Here's the Fed funds rate I was talking about. The investor inflation expectations are like 2.2. So, and they had been creeping up in the first part of the year as those hot readings came in. And then it's been creeping down for the last couple of months, which is what the Fed wants. This thing ought to be 2.0 is probably where the Fed would want this one. It's not core, it's not CPI exactly. It's kind of an investor number. All right. Here is my favorite spaghetti chart. The spaghetti is the point. I should say the upward pointing spaghetti or spaghetti above the black line. These are some of the major measures that the Fed uses to decide if we're in a recession or not. And they are all up, and this starts at May of 2023, so about over the past year. 5 of the 6 measures are above a year ago, and 1 of them is below, barely. A couple of them have trended down since late last year, but are still, they're still doing well. They're still well above the starting point a year ago. And so I would expect to think that the Fed would, they watch these numbers. They say these are the numbers. The NBER calls them out specifically. And, as long as these things are all showing growth, then you're probably not in a recession. If you were to see these things all peak and go down, like this one is not, like the blue one, you could argue has been coming down. This blue one may have peaked and is coming down. If you think of it that way, you might start to see a little bit of it. And so as you watch this, if you start to see sort of all of a sudden everything's on a peak and then all of a sudden everything is coming down, then you may have an issue. So keep that in mind, but nothing to worry about here. I got into an argument with a guy who actually is an expert on this stuff. I'm not sure why I argued with him, but I think he was wrong. He's got a conservative bent. One of the things that you find people talking about as a solution for Social Security is to remove the cap on the payroll tax, which is, somebody might know it exactly. Is it about 168,000 now? So above 168, you don't pay payroll tax up for Social Security.
I think it's 180, maybe.
All right, I have to check it. But it's in that range. You're making pretty good money as an individual if you are above the cap. You are taxed. The money up to that cap is taxed. Money above it is not. If you were to raise the cap, only that money above that current cap is taxed, meaning you're not paying a higher rate on all the other money. It's just some new money that wasn't taxed before is getting taxed. If you were to remove the cap, and here's 1A, no credit to benefits, meaning you don't give people any more money. You just remove the cap and people get the same benefit schedule they used to. That covers 73% of the 75-year shortfall. I've always told you guys about 70%, and that's what I said. If you start playing games with raising the benefits and doing different formulations, then the effect is reduced. Here are a couple of different options. Biden is saying if you were to raise the cap to 400, because that's what he's pledged, no tax hikes on people making less than 400, that covers 61% of the gap. I absolutely think this is a great policy idea because it's progressive. It only taxes the money above that threshold, 160, 180, whatever. That threshold goes up every year, by the way, as with inflation and people making more money and all that, it will continue. That threshold dollar amount will continue to go up. But you have a lot of good choices here in terms of how much it addresses. In a slightly more complicated way of thinking about it is the gap this would be like you'd have to raise the payroll tax by 3.5 to cover it if you just raise the payroll tax rate. So instead of, I think it's 13% now, you'd have to raise it to 16.5 to cover all of the shortfall. And here are some, and this one would cover, 0.96 from a, oh wait, let me think here a second. Remaining, I have to think about what that means. I'll apologize. I'm not sure exactly how to interpret the right-hand column. This column here, that's the coverage from the policy. This is another piece that I'm not sure I understand.
This is just salary though, right? This is not non-salary compensation like an executive would, which could be millions of dollars for a CEO that they're not currently paying any of this on, and they're getting taxed on capital gains on that, right? If they get stock options and stuff.
I'm not 100% sure. If you give an executive stock options and they exercise them in a year, I'm not sure if that would be taxed as income because it was part of their compensation or not. I think you're right. I think it's not, but I'm not 100%.
That's been my understanding. Not only do they not pay Social Security on any of that, but for the purposes of social justice, I mean, that would be a nice little loophole to close. On the other hand, those people may be big donors to both political parties.
I will take that as it's due. I'm curious too about that. I think you're right.
My understanding was if you held the options for the right length of time, it became long-term capital gains, which isn't all that long-term.
Yes. No. Okay. All right. So there was a myth that if you were to remove the cap, that it would cover 100% of the shortfall. I've seen progressives share that a lot on Social Security. Just be aware, it's if you follow Biden would likely do if he could, it's 61%. And if you did it without respect to that, just removing the cap, you could get 73. The economy is doing way better than Europe. So we're way out here. Our cumulative real GDP growth since before the pandemic is over 8%. Our economy is about 8% larger, even adjusted for inflation. Most of Europe is not grown very much. Their inflation is not, their cumulative inflation, that's what they call their HICP, is the inflation for them, also comparable. We're not particularly high in this area. We're kind of in the middle. So that's good news. And just a couple more things. Here's a list of talking points that you can share with your friends and family and online that relate to the things that we've covered in here. I'm not going to go through all these. You can read them at your leisure. This is a chart you've seen a million times, which compares 2019 and 2023. The average statistics adjusted for inflation, every measure is better in 2023. And here we always call it Bill's favorite chart. This is just an excerpt from the chart before. Just he likes to see the bars like this, and so this is what we have for some of the measures. Here's another one where it's easy to cut and paste this, and this looks great on Twitter. If you're sharing on Twitter, it just fits the space on Twitter very well. I stole it from the AFL-CIO. They did something like this on the Inflation Reduction Act, and I stole their format for other purposes. But this has some key things, and this doesn't change. Like this covers years. I'm comparing 2023 to others, so you don't need it to be updated every month. You can just share it. And here are some links. There's a short version of this presentation that I did on Twitter. So if you want to see the slides on Twitter and share some or all of them, it's real easy to do. You just click on this, control click, it'll take you right there. I do this, I take maybe 10 or 15, usually about 15 of the slides that we share here and put them on Twitter in one thread, so you have access to them all in an easy place, and you can bookmark it or do whatever else you need to be able to grab it quickly. So that's all for our prepared presentation.